So I discovered that when we did this deal, my topic was Deborah. Hands up if you know the story of Deborah. Right. Hands up if I was to ask you to come to the front and tell the story of Deborah. Right. Well, we've got a way of... I looked at the Bible reading. We could have had 2 chapters. I thought that might be a good deal. But I'm hoping... Can we still run the video with the sound and all of that? So this is... you'll be able to see the pictures there, but you should all be able to hear. So this is the story of Deborah from Judges chapter 4 and 5. We hope.
Deborah and Barak go into battle. During the time of Joshua, the Israelites conquered much of the land that God had promised to them, but there were still areas controlled by the Canaanites. God raised up judges to lead his people and help them live by his laws. When the Lord raised up a judge and people obeyed God, they lived in peace, and if they went into battle, they were victorious. But when the judge died, the people abandoned God and started worshiping other gods. When they did so, their enemies defeated them and they lived in great distress. After the death of a judge called Ehud, God's people turned to worshiping false gods again. As a result, God let them be conquered by King Jabin of Hazor, a Canaanite king. The commander of King Jabin's army was Sisera, who lived in Harosheth Hagoyim. Sisera, who had 900 iron chariots, ruthlessly oppressed the Israelites for 20 years. Then, they cried out to God for help. Deborah, the wife of Lapidoth, was a prophetess who was judging Israel at that time. She would sit under the palm of Deborah between Ramah and Bethel, and the Israelites would go to her for advice and to settle their disputes by God's laws. One day, Deborah sent for Barak, son of Abinoam, who lived in Kadesh in the region of Naphtali. Barak traveled south to meet her. Deborah told him, "This is what the Lord, the God of Israel, commands you to do. Gather 10,000 warriors from the tribes of Naphtali and Zebulun at Mount Tabor. I will call out Sisera, commander of Jabin's army, along with his chariots and warriors, to the Kishon River. There I will give you victory over him." Barak replied, "I will go, but only if you go with me." "Very well," Deborah replied, "I will go with you. But you will receive no honor in this venture, for the Lord's victory over Sisera will be at the hands of a woman." So Deborah went with him. Barak called together the tribes of Zebulun and Naphtali, who lived east of Lake Galilee, and 10,000 warriors went with him and Deborah to Mount Tabor. When Sisera heard Barak had gone up to Mount Tabor, he called for all 900 of his iron chariots and all his warriors, and they marched from Harosheth Hagoyim to the Kishon River. Deborah said to Barak, "Get ready. This is the day the Lord will give you victory over Sisera. The Lord is marching ahead of you." It had rained and the Kishon River was flooded. Barak led his 10,000 warriors down the slopes of Mount Tabor into battle. Sisera's chariots got bogged down in the wet clay and his warriors abandoned them to flee on foot. Barak chased them all the way to Harosheth Hagoyim, killing all of Sisera's warriors. However, Sisera fled towards Zaanannim, where Eber the Kenite had pitched his tent. He was on friendly terms with King Jabin of Hazor. Eber's wife was called Yael. Yael went out to meet Sisera and said, "Sir, hide in my tent. Don't be afraid." So he went into her tent. She gave him milk to quench his thirst and then hid him under a blanket. "Stand at the door of the tent," he told her. "If anybody comes, say there is no one here." But when Sisera fell asleep from exhaustion, Yael quietly crept up to him with a hammer and tent peg in her hand. She drove the tent peg through the temple of his head and killed him. When Barak came looking for Sisera, Yael went out to meet him. "Come, and I will show you the man you are looking for." Barak followed her into the tent and found Sisera lying there dead. From that time on, Israel became stronger and stronger until they finally destroyed King Jabin and lived in freedom. Deborah wrote a victory song which they sang in celebration. There was peace in the land for the next 40 years. If you like this video, give it a thumbs up. Share and leave a comment. Subscribe.
If you like the video, you can give a thumbs up. It was quite quick, but hopefully you got the idea of the story. Right. If we've got the PowerPoint, we'll see if we can... So Deborah, I described her as wife, prophet, judge, leader, triumphant. That's the summary of the story. And we've had Judges 4 and 5, roughly. Here's the history. I used to be a history teacher. I've confessed that to many of you in the past. And I always just check if anybody falls asleep instantly when I mention that. But obviously, I was the sort of history teacher that kept people awake. Just to give you an idea of where this comes in the outline of Bible history, Moses, the Exodus, the wandering in the desert, they still debate when exactly that happened. But we think it was probably in the 13th century before Christ. And Joshua, the entry into the promised land, happened about 1230. That's not 12:30 at lunchtime. It means at 1230 BC. And then the period of the judges lasts from about 1200 BC to 1020 BC, so about 1,000 years before Jesus was born. And then after the judges came the kings. What was the name of the first king? You didn't get a quiz. The first king was Saul. The second king was? Very good. We won't go any further because you might lose track. So that gives you an idea of where we are in the history of the Bible in this. And then I thought quickly the story. If you know the story, you will know that it is dramatic. It's also thematic. Did you notice that in the story, it started off with the Israelites being disobedient. It started then, continued with them being invaded. And Sisera had 900 iron chariots. That's interesting, that's the thing that was remembered. I can imagine they were probably the most fearsome war machine of the time. 900 iron chariots coming in would be pretty fearsome. And they ruled over the people. They oppressed them. It says that, doesn't it, we heard the reading, for 20 years. And then I don't know whether you picked this up. After 20 years, the people called out to God. I was quite interested. It took 20 years of the 900 iron chariots being around and the oppression and all of that. And eventually, they called out to God. One of the themes of Judges is the fact that the people disobey God. They worship the Canaanite gods. They moved into Canaan. They're attracted by the idea that they maybe ought to worship the local gods. It was a very strong tradition that gods were associated with a particular place. So there'd have been a big sort of pressure to think, well, we ought to move in and worship those gods. And then often when that happened, always when that happened, things went badly wrong. There's a sort of lesson there, isn't there? When we take our eyes off serving the true God, things can go badly wrong. So that's the theme, and this story fits into the theme. Deborah is the fourth of the judges, and her story is dramatic. I always think the story is a little bit like one specially written for the scout troop. Some of you will be able to work out why I say that. The only bit of the story I can remember from my childhood is the fact, and I remember there was an illustration in an old history book we had of the man, the woman, and the tent peg and the hammer. Is that sufficient detail for you to be going, oh, sorry about the lights, I've no idea what's happening. It's just a new way of distracting you from what's being said. So it's a dramatic story. And I have to say, I want to be honest, it's problematic. One of the heroes of the story is a woman who invites somebody into her tent, plies him with milk, sees he's tired, tucks him up, gets him asleep, and then kills him. And she is praised as a great hero. And there isn't time this morning to go into the long explanation, but you'll know that the way in which the Israelite people went into the land of Canaan was marked by lots of violence. And the stories that, and people often quite badly abuse the stories because they think if God said that was okay 1,000 years before the birth of Jesus, it must still be okay. And there are still people who claim that kind of authority. God told me to go and kill somebody. You have to be very careful how you use Old Testament stories. The point of this story is that when people turned to God, he gave them victory against the odds. So the story is problematic, but it's got quite a lot to tell us. So here's Deborah, the person. And Deborah is an interesting person. We're told very quickly in Judges chapter 4, she was a wife, she was a prophet, she was a judge, and she was a leader. We might not find that quite so odd now. People across the ancient world would have found that completely amazing. Why? Because in most societies, women did not become a prophet, a judge, and a leader. And what I find interesting in the book of Judges, there is never any kind of special pleading made for this. It is just stated. Deborah is the fourth of the judges. She is a woman, she's a wife. She has these responsibilities. She is a multi-talented, multi-gifty, multitasking person, which I know all the women know is perfectly legitimate and perfectly realistic. And I know the men are thinking, yes, but that's the reality here in this story. And it's worth emphasizing. I have met so many people who are convinced that the Bible is misogynistic, is against women, and they say God's against women. Here is a woman who is, without any comment in the Bible at all, just brought to the fore and recognized as being the significant leader of that moment. And the interesting thing within the story, if you notice a little detail, is that Barak, who is not Barack Obama, but is a different Barak, is the one who comes and says he'll only go into battle if she goes with him. The man who's in charge of 10,000 men in the army will only go into battle if the woman who is in touch with God goes with him. Barak was sensible enough to know that he needed to have the person who understood what God wanted to be with him. And it's interesting because one of the very puzzling things about the Bible is when you get to the heroes of faith in Hebrews 11, Barak gets mentioned and Deborah doesn't. Which may convince some of the women that there we go again. Here's Deborah, who's the real hero, doesn't get a mention. Maybe Barak gets a mention because he was willing to have faith in the woman that God had appointed to be the judge and the leader. So what Deborah did was she sat under the palm of Deborah, probably a different Deborah. I love the idea. She didn't sit and say, I shall name this tree after myself. There was a different Deborah, and she probably thought, my name's Deborah, I'll go and sit under that tree, was probably how it worked. And people would come to her for judgment, that she was a judge, and that's what happened. And that meant if they had disputes, they would come to her, and they would listen to her. She was a prophet. That meant that she heard from God, and she passed on the message of God to the people. And I'll let you into a secret. I think if I was going to someone to judge my dispute, I'd quite like to go to somebody who was in touch with God and was hearing from God. And people clearly recognize that. But the word that's used for judge is also the word that's used for leader. And Deborah was the leader of the people. And when this oppression came and they cried out to God, Deborah was the one who came up with what God wanted them to do. And they went to fight the battle. And Barak went with 10,000 men, and Sisera, the general of the army of the Canaanite king, came with his 900 iron chariots. And it wasn't quite David and Goliath, but it was an unequal struggle. And just as we were praying, I think I could hear rain beating down on the roof. I don't know whether we were having a heavy shower, I just imagined it. But the rain was significant. The rain helped the Israelites to win. But they knew it wasn't an accident that the rain came at that moment. They knew it was a sign that God was with them. And Sisera, the general, having lost the battle, tries to escape. And Barak has been told by Deborah that because he wants her to go with him, he will not have the honor of winning the battle. In those times, being the leader of a winning battle was a big thing. It was part of the purpose of their life. And everybody, I think, around Barak assumed that Deborah would get the honor. And in the end, it was Yael who got the honor of being the one who destroyed the oppressor. She was the one with the hammer and the tent peg and the glass of milk. And Barak was not honored. A foreign woman, a woman who wasn't even part of the Israelites, got the honor for being the one who delivered the final blow in the battle. So Deborah had these multi-roles, and she was in touch with God, and she led the people. One of the things she realized is, when I said she was triumphant, she knew And she explained to the people that they would only win the victory as long as they trusted in God. The whole story of the history of the Israelite people is not one about who had the best tactics in battle, not who had the best weapons. Sisera had the best weapons. He had 900 iron chariots. But it was those who trusted in God. Again, you can have a long debate about how exactly that works. We've got to be very careful. There have been times in our history when we've assumed that God's on our side. And sometimes that might have been understandable, and sometimes it probably wasn't. Again, I just want to give that word of warning. We have to be very careful. But in the story that we're given, the people who are seeking to follow a God look to God for victory, and God is the one who gives the victory. And Deborah was able to demonstrate that to them and to lead them in that way. And when she sings her song in chapter 5, I've no idea whether it was a rap or what kind of style of music it was, but she sang her song of triumph, and one of the lines that she uses is, "The mountains shook because of the Lord." She knew, and the people knew, that God was able to intervene, was able to do things, was able to be on their side when they looked to him. It wasn't always automatic, but they knew that without God, they could do nothing. So God used Deborah. Very simple message. If you want to learn something from the reality about Deborah, one of the realities is that God can use you. God can use those who would not instantly appear to be the ones that could be used. God can use those at the front, can use those who sit in the seats. God can use those who've got the gift of the gab. He can use those whose only gift may be to hold out a hand to help people. But God can use people. And here's Deborah's song. Those who lived in the villages of Israel would not fight. They held back until I, Deborah, came. I came as a mother in Israel. War came to the city gates. Then God chose new leaders. You can read the rest of the song. He celebrated that God had acted when they looked to him. Part of our whole series that we're following through is the idea that tell her story, that God is in new beginnings. This was a new beginning for the people of Israel because the woman that God had chosen to be their judge and their leader led them, followed what God wanted, and saw the difference come, and saw the people set free. And what I loved about this was, it says at the end, there were 40 years of peace. 40 years is used in the Bible as it's a kind of symbolic. I was reading the history about the dates and so on and discovered there's a big argument goes on with the scholars about whether 40 years is really 40 years or whether it's a symbolic, round number. I'm not sure I'm too bothered about that. 40 years of peace sounds like a pretty good length to me. They had 20 years of oppression. They called out to God. God intervened through Deborah dramatically, straightforwardly, miraculously, and what followed was 40 years of peace. And Deborah sat under the palm of Deborah, and people came to her with their problems, but they didn't have to worry about somebody coming with an iron chariot because God had intervened and had defeated the enemy. So I thought I'd finish with a very simple application. You probably worked it out already. I put on the screen there you with a question mark. And some of you are facing challenges. This is the extent to which we all face challenges every day, don't we? There's different levels of challenge. Some of them are big, life-changing challenges. Some of them are little things that can be very big to us and don't seem very significant to anybody else. And there's a very simple lesson from this story. Please don't wait 20 years to cry out to God. Because when we do face challenges, there are all sorts of things we can do. One of the places we should start is by seeking God's wisdom. It's simple. It doesn't guarantee the problem changes overnight. I wish these stories of God's miraculous intervention happened every time somebody called. They didn't. But they can. And the only way the miracle can happen is if we're prepared to give it a chance to happen. If you're facing a challenge, talk to God about it. You'll discover that God knows and God is with you. And sometimes the answer is that God helps you to overcome the challenge. And sometimes the answer is that God walks with you through the challenge. But the promise of Scripture is that he will never leave you. He will never forsake you. He will never let you go. And then I put, God can use me. One of the things that I think is encouraging as we go through these stories, there are people that God uses. Deborah was a wife and a judge. People expected God to use her because she was a prophet. But then Jael got used because she was part of the story. Nobody had heard of her. She was an unknown person. And part of the way the Bible reveals the way that God works is that he's not interested in how famous people are. He's not interested in celebrity, which is one of the things that interests our society more than almost anything else. Name dropping might useless, you see, in that situation. Because the names that God drops are the people who trust him and look to him and want to serve him. And some of those do become famous. Millions of them don't. But the ones who get the reward are the ones who are faithful, the ones who trust God, the ones who keep walking with him. And that reward is far greater than fame. Quite hard for many people in our society to understand. And then the final thing I put there was, can I know peace? And I think it's one of the great challenges in our society now, as it has been through the centuries in different ways. There's lots of stress in a lecture theatre at 10:30 when we can't get anything to work. There are more serious stresses in our lives, aren't there? People we're concerned about, people close to us, people we long to see walking in a different way, people we're concerned for their health and their well-being. Within all of that, the promise of Scripture is that through Jesus we can know peace. So as we finish, I just wanted to pray and pray for you and pray that the story of Deborah will encourage you, will help you to realize something which we all knew, that God can use men as well as women, that women are enormously important in the story of Scripture. Don't let anybody tell you that the Bible is against women. If they do, you can send them to me and I'll try and explain why. But more importantly, God can use us and he wants us to know peace. Let's pray. Father, I just want to lift those who are listening this morning and know they're facing a struggle, know that there's things that are pressing in on them, know that they feel oppressed, that life is difficult, life is hard. Father, I pray that as they call out to you, they would receive from you and they'd receive the gift of your peace. So that in the midst of the struggle, whether the struggle is overcome or not, they would know your presence and they would know your peace. We pray strength and encouragement. And we thank you that in the end of this story, there was victory, there was triumph, and there was 40 years of peace. Father, we pray that for many people listening this morning, there would be that triumph and they would know your peace. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen.